In this video, we're going to pick up with Herbert Sobel's story where Band of Brothers leaves off, including what became of Sobel after World War II. This includes his time in the military, his marriage and children, and a tragic decision that left him confined to a nursing home for nearly 2 decades. In order to try and put his mental state later in life into some context, it's important to understand what we know about Herbert Sobel that could have contributed to his decline. Herbert Sobel was born on January 26, 1912 in Chicago, Illinois. He was the second of 4 children to the Hungarian-born Max Sobel and his wife Dora, born in Chicago. Herbert had an older brother named Julian and 2 younger sisters, Marjorie and Carol. He was raised in a Jewish family and attended high school at Culver Military Academy, a strict boarding school in Indiana, where he excelled on the swim team. Following high school, Herbert worked as a clothing salesman and went to the University of Illinois, where he studied business. He graduated from college in 1933. Herbert Sobel was then commissioned as an officer in the Organized Reserves, the precursor to today's U.S. Army Reserve. By 1937, he had been promoted to the rank of first lieutenant. In 1940, the year before Pearl Harbor, Sobel was elevated to active duty. He was stationed at Camp Grant on the outskirts of Rockford, Illinois. He then enlisted in the Military Police Corps and was sent to Fort Riley in Kansas. In 1942, Sobel volunteered to join the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, at Camp Toccoa in Georgia. Herbert Sobel became the first member of Easy Company and its first commanding officer. He was in charge of Easy Company during basic training at Toccoa. It is here that we catch up with Sobel during the first episode of Band of Brothers, titled Currahee. 6'1" actor David Schwimmer superbly portrays Sobel in the series, capturing his slender build, long face, and tall stature. As I detailed in my previous video on the Sobel vs. Winters feud, it's true that as the commander of Easy Company, Sobel was a strict disciplinarian. He was known for his grueling training exercises, including running his men up and down Currahee Mountain near Camp Toccoa. As seen in Band of Brothers, it was not uncommon for Sobel to run his men up and down Currahee after a full meal. To Sobel's credit, despite his tall, lanky build, he made it a point to do all of the exercises with his men, including shouting, "Hi-ho Silver," as he ran up Currahee with them. Like in the series, Sobel was known to pick on his men for the tiniest infractions, including having lint on their chevrons, the tiniest bit of rust on their rifle, or a dirty weapon sling. If he didn't like you, Sobel would always find an infraction, including marking men down for dirty ears and revoking their weekend pass. Dick Winters stated in his memoir, "A man could not pass inspection if Sobel had a grudge against him, and it seemed that our company commander held many grudges." A favorite punishment for someone who had displeased Sobel was making them dig a 6 by 6 by 6 foot hole in the ground and then having them fill it back in. While Sobel's nitpicking might have seemed excessive to the men, there was a point to it. For example, not taking care of a minuscule amount of rust on a rifle will lead to the presence of more rust, and a rusty rifle becomes a useless rifle, and a useless rifle can get men killed. Making a man dig a 6-foot deep hole in the ground might seem pointless, but being able to dig a good deep foxhole could save a soldier's life when the shells are falling. Sobel's harsh treatment is no different than what Special Forces instructors do today, and in many ways, Sobel's training approach was ahead of its time. And as noticed by Colonel Robert Sink, Sobel got results. His men could march further, perform better in the dark, and physically outperform the other companies. Despite the men recognizing that Sobel's methods were effective, many still despised him. While the series implies Sobel was unique in this sense, in reality, it wasn't all too uncommon for GIs to hate their company commanders. Years later, almost every veteran who served under Sobel in Easy Company would credit him with being the reason for their success as a company and how they managed to survive the war. In a strange way, it kind of filled you with pride, recalled Tech Sergeant Don Malarkey. You got the idea he was hardening us for tougher times to come. Some of the veterans have even openly stated that the book and movie are unjust to Sobel and misrepresent him. For example, Private First Class Bill Wingate said that he doesn't believe that Bill Dukeman getting chewed out by Sobel for having a loose collar ever happened. "I don't remember that," said Wingate, and I stood in ranks right behind Bill Dukeman every damn formation we had at Toccoa. I don't know why anybody made that up, but somebody sure as hell did. I think Sobel was as fair a guy as anybody who came down the road. He was tough, yes. He was as tough as anybody you'll ever know, but he was not a bastard. Now, it didn't help that Sobel would often shout rather than speak. His high-pitched, rasp-like voice would just irritate you, recalled Dick Winters. His tone didn't change during meetings with the officers either. He was very domineering. There was no give and take, said Winters. According to Stephen Ambrose, Sobel had no friends. None went on pass with him, none sought out his company. No one in Easy knew anything about his previous life, and no one cared. Dick Winters recalled, at the end of the day, Sobel went one way and we officers went the other, hoping not to run into him at the officers' club. Ambrose's statement is a bit excessive and is meant to sell Sobel as a character everyone detests more than it's in line with reality. We know that First Sergeant Evans was a favorite of Sobel's. Because of this, Evans, like Sobel, was also unpopular among the men. Evans even demonstrated loyalty to Sobel when he chose not to participate in the NCO mutiny against Sobel in England. It's also important to remember that Ambrose did not interview every member of Easy Company and instead relied on the viewpoints of a select number of veterans. Colonel Robert Strayer, the 2nd Battalion commander, expressed admiration for Sobel. In a 1992 letter to Dick Winters that Strayer wrote after reading the book, he commented, Sobel had a lot to do with the bringing together of the men, as he was a rigid disciplinarian, no doubt, which was really needed to induct the civilians into a true fighting force in short time. He was also strict with himself. Sobel was the only company CO who was always on time and did as he was told. Strayer also said that Sobel would fight for his men. This included George Lavinson, who Strayer was going to remove from the company until Sobel fought for him and convinced Strayer to make Lavinson his adjutant to keep him away from the troops who didn't like him. While it's difficult to argue that Captain Herbert Sobel wasn't highly effective at turning civilian volunteers into robust, combat-ready soldiers, his ability to lead men on the battlefield was another story. In his letter, Strayer told Winters, I did think Sobel was a good training officer, but definitely not a leader of troops. As seen in the series, Sobel was inept at making tactical decisions and was often confused during combat exercises. The series showing him as being unable to read a map and acting impulsively during field exercises is accurate. It's true that the men feared that Sobel would get them killed if he led them into combat. Sergeant Amos Buck Taylor recalled, some of the men downright hated him even to the point where Sobel's life was in danger. As NCOs, we had all heard comments from other enlisted men, such as, boy, if I ever get Sobel in my sights, he's a goner, stuff like that. There was a strong feeling among the men that Sobel couldn't be trusted in a combat situation. Here's my conclusion. Captain Sobel was a good training officer, strict. He wanted his men to be the best. I admire him for that, but you could not trust his judgment in a battle situation. On one occasion, Easy Company was going through a combat range with live ammunition, firing at pop-up targets. Sobel experienced some near misses, recalled Edward Tipper. More than one shot was aimed from the rear and side to crack by close to Sobel's head. He'd flop down, kind of bounce around and shout something, and jump up again. There was much laughing and gesturing from the men. I can't believe that Sobel thought what was happening was accidental, but maybe he did. Anyway, he kept jumping up and down and running around as if everything were normal. The shots whizzed by about a foot from Sobel's head. As seen in Band of Brothers, other pranks that the men played on Herbert Sobel included Private George Luz imitating Major Oliver Horton's voice during a field exercise. Unlike what's seen in Band of Brothers, the real incident happened at night while Easy Company was leading the battalion on a cross-country march. Sobel was in front, and the barbed wire fences were slowing the battalion down. In Stephen Ambrose's book, there's no mention of Sobel being lost at the time or confused while trying to read a map. It does state that while pretending to be Major Horton, Private Luz called out, Captain Sobel, what's the holdup? The barbed wire, Sobel replied, believing he was addressing Major Horton, the 2nd Battalion executive officer. Cut those fences, Luz called out. Yes, sir, Sobel replied. The next morning, a group of Wiltshire farmers complained to Colonel Robert Strayer. They were enraged that their fences had been cut and their cows had gotten out. Like in the series, Colonel Strayer called in Sobel. "Why did you cut those fences?" "I was ordered to cut them, sir." "By whom?" Strayer demanded. "Major Horton." "Can't be," responded Strayer. "Horton's on leave, in London." Sobel was given hell. He never found out who tricked him, and therefore was never able to properly exact revenge. The most malicious prank that the men played on Herbert Sobel is one that is not shown in Band of Brothers. It happened during a training exercise where several men, including Sobel, volunteered to be casualties so that the medics could practice bandaging wounds, improvising casts, and evacuating the wounded to the regiment's aid station. The medics gave Sobel an anesthetic that knocked him unconscious. They then made a small incision to make him think they had performed an appendectomy on him. According to Ambrose, they sewed up the incision and covered it with bandages and surgical tape. When Sobel came to, he was understandably livid, but the guilty medics were nowhere to be found, and no one in Easy Company would give them up. In Dick Winter's memoir, Beyond Band of Brothers, he recounts this story, describing the men making a small incision in Sobel's abdomen, but he does not mention that it was deep enough to need stitches. It's possible that Ambrose embellished the incident a bit for his book, but regardless, it was still a cruel trick to play. HBO's Band of Brothers doesn't include this prank because it would obviously elicit too much sympathy for Herbert Sobel in a series that wants to firmly portray him as the antagonist. It's stories like these that make me wonder who was the actual bully. Was it Sobel, or was it some of the various men in Easy Company who thought it would be okay to inflict such physical harm on someone for a joke? Or was it both? Sobel's harsh treatment of his men got worse after they arrived in Aldbourne, England. Soldiers from the 82nd Airborne who were stationed nearby would tell members of the 101st of their experiences in combat in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. Everyone in the 101st, especially the officers, felt the pressure of being on the cusp of warfare. Captain Sobel was especially affected. It showed up in his disposition, said Dick Winters. He was becoming more sour and sadistic. It was reaching the point that it was unbearable. As I detailed in my video on the Herbert Sobel versus Dick Winters feud, things came to a head between the two men when Sobel initiated a court-martial against Winters for failing to inspect the latrine at the time Sobel specified, despite Sobel supposedly modifying the time without successfully notifying Winters. Ultimately, Colonel Strayer decided it would be best to transfer Winters out of Easy Company, making him battalion mess officer, a job that in Winters' opinion was typically given to guys who couldn't do anything else. Herbert Sobel despised Dick Winters. As Stephen Ambrose noted in Band of Brothers, Sobel had the authority over the men. Lieutenant Winters had their respect. Unlike Sobel, Winters was a natural-born leader. Sobel could see it, and he hated Winters for it. After Winters' transfer, the non-commissioned officers in Easy Company intended to resign their ranks in protest, refusing to go into battle under Sobel's command, believing Sobel would lead them to their deaths. Colonel Sink gave the non-coms hell for their attempted mutiny. However, in the end, Sink decided to replace Sobel, removing him as Easy Company commander and assigning him to command a new parachute training school in the village of Chilton Foliet in Wiltshire, England. There, Sobel would provide jump training to more than 400 non-combat personnel, including chaplains, doctors, and engineers, in preparation for D-Day. Colonel Sink replaced Sobel with First Lieutenant Thomas Meehan. The transfer was a crushing blow to Sobel. Easy Company had been his baby since its inception at Toccoa. Now he had lost it. The message to Sobel was clear. After transforming the men into elite soldiers, Colonel Sink no longer had confidence that Sobel could lead them into battle. Having Easy Company taken away from him was something Sobel never truly got over, and perhaps rightfully so, even if it was what was best for the company and the lives of the men. Ironically, the man who replaced Sobel, First Lieutenant Thomas Meehan, would die on D-Day when the Douglas C-47 Skytrain aircraft he was a passenger on was shot down when it was hit by German anti-aircraft fire. All 21 men on board were killed, including the entire company headquarters. First Sergeant William Evans was among the men who lost their lives. The plane had been loaded with Bangalore torpedoes. This is the plane that Herbert Sobel would have been on if he had remained in charge of Easy Company. Sergeant Bill Garnier later commented, "In reality, we saved Captain Sobel's life." While true, this realization probably didn't bring much comfort to Sobel. After all, it was Sobel's nemesis, Dick Winters, who took over command of Easy Company after Meehan was declared missing in action. Sobel did jump into Normandy on D-Day, but not with Easy Company. He did so as part of Regimental Company headquarters. Upon landing, he gathered 4 lost paratroopers and they used grenades to take out a German machine gun nest. He then joined the rest of the division near Carentan. His efforts earned him a combat infantry badge. After jumping into France, Sobel returned to the training school at Chilton-Folliot. Only this time, he was moved to assistant commander instead of being the CO. On March 8, 1945, Sobel was appointed the regiment's S4, the logistical officer for the 506th. He was in charge of ferrying supplies to and from the front, which put him in occasional contact with Easy Company again. After being made the logistics officer, he would have joined the remainder of the regiment, who were in Mormelon, France at the time. It was in Mormelon that Sobel was walking down the street and saw Dick Winters coming in the opposite direction. Sobel dropped his head and tried to walk by Winters without saluting. Winters called out, "Captain Sobel, we salute the rank, not the man." Winters had recently been promoted to major, and Sobel was still a captain. It's hard to imagine that it wasn't an angering and humiliating moment for Sobel. Band of Brothers fictionalizes the encounter as happening in Austria after VE Day, which is inaccurate. Sobel was one of the only members of Easy Company who didn't have any physical wounds from the war. However, according to Ambrose, Sobel experienced deep mental ones. After World War II, most of the men from Easy Company would never see Herbert Sobel again. He returned to Chicago and worked as a credit manager for a wholesaler, and then in the same role for a telephone equipment company. He stayed in the Army National Guard for many years and eventually retired as a lieutenant colonel. While visiting a wounded fellow soldier at Heinz VA Hospital in Chicago, Herbert Sobel met an attractive blonde-haired and blue-eyed American nurse there named Reva, who was 9 years his junior. She herself was a veteran, having worked as a nurse in a hospital in Italy during the war. They married and had 3 sons. They also had a daughter who died shortly after birth. Herbert Sobel was said to be a devoted family man. He was a stern but also supportive and loving father. He doted on his wife, waking early every morning to make her breakfast. In the winter, he would clear the snow from her car and warm it for her after pulling it up to the front of the house. As Herbert's son Michael explained in Marcus Brotherton's book, We Who Are Alive and Remain, Untold Stories from the Band of Brothers, his father was Jewish and his mother was Catholic. His father's side of the family never really accepted his mother, as they weren't in favor of Herbert marrying a Catholic. Growing up, the children attended Catholic church with their mother. Herbert would occasionally attend and sometimes went to synagogue with his sister. In the home, there was not a lot of discussion of faith and religion. However, Michael stated that his father never used profanity or lost his temper. He was a great dad, said Michael. It appeared that the civilian Herbert Sobel was a very different man from the one who had presided over Easy Company, at least the man who's depicted in Band of Brothers. Sobel never talked to his wife about his time in the war. His son Michael would ask his father, but Sobel never offered any information. Like many veterans, he kept the war to himself. However, Sobel harbored deep mental wounds that would begin to show. Clarence Hester, who had been Sobel's executive officer after the formation of Easy Company, was on a business trip in Chicago in the early 1960s. He contacted Sobel and they had lunch together. Hester said that Sobel was bitter toward Easy Company and life in general. During the 1960s, Sobel gradually became estranged from his family. The conservative Herbert Sobel became at odds with his son Michael, who attended Berkeley and became involved with political activism. Then, things would forever change one day in 1970. Sobel put a small caliber pistol to his left temple and pulled the trigger. He survived, but the bullet severed his optic nerves and left him permanently blind. It also left him with brain damage that seemed to have affected various parts of his memory. After hearing the news, Michael went home to see his mother, who was inconsolable. She did not know why Herbert would try to do such a thing, but postulated that he thought he had cancer and was unwilling to get tested for the disease. Herbert Sobel spent the next 17 years of his life in care facilities, first in a Veteran Affairs assisted living facility in Waukegan, Illinois, before being transferred to a rundown private nursing home. Though he had friends in the VA ward and was ambulatory, he fell in and out of being lucid and was at times in a semi-vegetative state. Sometime after he entered the VA facility, Herbert and his wife Reva divorced, and he mostly lost touch with his sons. In the 1980s, Sergeant Bill Garnier, who was involved with the 101st Airborne Association, tried to reach out to Sobel to see if he wanted to be part of the association. Garnier was able to track down Sobel's sister, Maxine, who told him that Sobel was in a bad mental state and that he directed his anger at Easy Company. In an act of kindness, Garnier decided to pay Sobel's membership dues, despite Sobel never becoming involved with the association. Herbert Sobel died of malnutrition at the private nursing home in 1987 at age 75. His immediate family members, who had lost touch with him over the years, were initially unaware of his death. His sister Maxine tended to the burial details and had Herbert cremated. Several days, perhaps even a week after he died, Maxine phoned Herbert's ex-wife Reva to give her the news. According to Maxine, his death was received by all our family as a release for him and for us. Stephen Ambrose misleadingly states in Band of Brothers that neither Herbert's ex-wife nor anyone from Easy Company attended his funeral service, calling it a sad affair. After Herbert's sister Maxine read the book, she pointed out, "Actually, we had no funeral, so for the book to say no one attended, there was nothing to attend." Ambrose seems to have been intentionally distorting the truth to try and reinforce the theme in his book that no one liked Sobel. The more I learn about Herbert Sobel, the more I sympathize with him. He was significantly more complex than the petty tyrant that Stephen Ambrose in the HBO miniseries tried to make him out to be. Both present a one-sided and exaggerated portrayal of Sobel, a man whose life was far more nuanced than what we see in the series. Band of Brothers needed a villain, and according to Sobel's son Michael, his father was the obvious fall guy. In the book, We Who Are Alive and Remain, Michael said that he found it interesting that just prior to the release of the series, HBO flew the veterans and their immediate families to various premieres, including to Europe. However, the Sobel family was never contacted. You might be thinking, it's not surprising that Herbert Sobel's son would defend him, especially since he wasn't there during World War II to see exactly how his father commanded the men of Easy Company. However, it's worth noting that it wasn't just Sobel's son and sister who have spoken out against his portrayal in Band of Brothers. Some of the veterans who served with Sobel have spoken out as well. When Easy Company veteran Private First Class Bill Wingate was in Paris with HBO for the premiere of the series, he was talking with Colonel Robert Strayer and General Sal Matheson. All three men had served with Sobel. Colonel Strayer, who had been the battalion commander, spoke up with regard to the series' portrayal of Captain Herbert Sobel. "You know, what they did to Sobel was not right," said Strayer. General Matheson added, "That was the wrong thing for them to do." Wingate told the two men that he had voiced similar concerns while discussing the series with other people. It's obvious that episode 1 of Band of Brothers would be less enjoyable without David Schwimmer's Sobel as the heel. The series needed an antagonist to pit the men against during basic training, before the Germans become their antagonists in the episodes that follow them into combat. Herbert's sister Maxine said that Stephen Ambrose's description of her brother is incomprehensible to her. "Herb was always a wonderful brother to my sister and me, and a devoted son to our mother," she recalled. "He was attentive, caring, and always considerate. His sense of humor was acknowledged by all who knew him. These attributions were his before, during, and after the war. It is this side of Herbert Sobel that Stephen Ambrose never knew about. This is because he never reached out to Sobel's family during his research, instead shaping his entire depiction of Sobel from what he was told by several of the men of Easy Company." Years earlier, in 1993, after the release of Stephen Ambrose's book, Herbert Sobel's sister, Maxine, had written Dick Winters, upset over her brother's portrayal. Winters then wrote to the men, asking them to write Maxine and share some of their positive stories about Sobel. "She has read your stories in Band of Brothers about her brother," Winters wrote, "but, as we all know, there are many more stories, and let's be honest, there are more than just a few good stories that could be told." Winters is essentially acknowledging that the book doesn't tell the whole truth about Herbert Sobel. Winters himself even admitted that Sobel was the finest training officer they could have hoped for. In 2002, Herbert Sobel's son Michael was an impromptu guest speaker at the Easy Company reunion in Arizona. "One of the men's sons hugged me through tears," Michael recalled. "I can't even tell you who it was. It was such an emotional time." And he said, "My father told me that if I ever had the honor of meeting you, to let you know that it was because of your father that I'm alive today." "That was pretty much the sentiment of the men I had the honor to meet that day," said Michael. "I received calls from men who served with my father and who praise him to this day." I hope this video helps to provide a more accurate picture of Herbert Sobel, both as a soldier and a father, including the tragic final years of his life. After all, Sobel deserves a legacy that is not defined by what works best for a book or a Hollywood miniseries, but rather one that is defined by how he actually lived. In the least, his service deserves our respect. If you enjoyed this video on Herbert Sobel, be sure to check out our video on the Sobel vs. Winters feud that is linked on the screen. If you want to see more videos on Band of Brothers, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Anchors away, my friends.